Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you, and a special thanks to Ashley Moyes and the McDonald Center for the kind invitation to give this paper today. I'm going to just share my screen and dive right in here. So here we go. Coronavirus has consumed more lives in a short period of time than does seasonal influenza. And it has proven itself especially vicious toward the elderly. The virus has magnified pre-pandemic concerns that those living in Western society care little for their oldest members. Headlines such as the New York Times, "COVID-19 kills only old people." Only? Why are we okay with old people dying? Or this one, why are so many people ready to let the elderly die? Reinforce the point. Society seems to care little for its oldest members. Now, the writer Jean Amery, whose work helped to animate the themes of this conference, doubtless would have agreed that in today's world, the young are more concerned with their own lives than with those of the elderly. Amery was born in Austria in 1911, and he had a particularly complicated relationship with growing old. The title of his book, On Aging, Revolt and Resignation, sums up his feelings on the matter. He would both rebel against and resign himself to the inexorable. On Aging, Revolt and Resignation. It's a short book, only 5 chapters in length. Amery says that he was, quote, compelled by nothing more than an inclination to be contemplative, end quote. And the 5 essays that compose his 5 chapters address 5 domains of how aging human beings relate to time, to their own bodies, to society, to civilization, and ultimately to death. Now, in what follows in this paper I'm going to give, I will build off Amery's work to consider 3 ideas. First, whether coronavirus has in fact robbed the elderly of their agency and ushered in certain death. Second, whether aging makes it possible to reimagine one's agency. And third, how previous generations sought to bolster the agency of the aged through a revived ars moriendi. So on this first point, coronavirus, agency of the elderly, and certain death. Amery's 3rd chapter, I told you there are 5, so his middle chapter, focuses on how elders come to feel invisible. The title of the chapter is The Look of Others. Elders go unnoticed by the younger and more robust. Amery opens with reference to this book by Jean-Louis Curtis, La Quarantaine, which I don't speak French, so forgive me. Amery says it's not a great book, but it is reflectively beautiful. The book was published in the 1960s, and it tells the story of 2 married couples at the prime of life, which, in case you were wondering, is their 40s, whose relevance, the relevance of these 2 married couples, is challenged by time itself. Now, Amery applauds Curtis's use in the book's title of the word quarantine. It has 2 distinct meanings. On the one hand, in the French, quarantine refers to the decade of aging between 40 and 50. And on the other hand, it refers to what Amery calls the hygienic isolation imposed upon human beings no longer young, their quarantine. So there we have it, quarantine as both the 5th decade's plateau between life's ascent and descent, as well as the social isolation imposed on the old by the young. Now, the former is a state of being neither sought nor received, right? You're just in your 40s. The latter, however, that hygienic isolation is imposed on the old by the young. It is compulsory. It renders the aged passive, bereft of their agency. Now, I was intrigued, if somewhat flabbergasted, to find out that as a person in her 40s, this social isolation, this quarantine actually referred to me. I had been placed metaphorically in quarantine as a woman in her 40s. According to Amory, I am quarantined by age during my quarantine for the coronavirus. But there is a second meaning of the word, and that is the social isolation imposed on the old by the young. And this is a concept that takes on heightened significance during a pandemic that has disproportionately targeted the elderly. In recent months, all people, old and young, have been quarantined. We all have been hygienically isolated, to borrow from Amory. Halting human contact thwarts spread of disease, logic tells us. And if the elderly are especially vulnerable, they must be especially quarantined. As a result, everyone has well-intentioned guidance for society's oldest members. The Centers for Disease Control here in the United States offers what it calls COVID-19 guidance for older adults. Medical centers have published brochures, and even mainstream newspapers have their own recommendations. The guidelines tend to converge on the need for methods that are principally protective. And perhaps rightly so. But less commonly do we read advice to societal elders that bolsters their sense of agency. And as a medical doctor myself, I can tell you that I've read tons of this material, and I have not seen much, if any, that really aspires to bolster the agency of the elderly. And as I've stated, with good reason. In fact, Amory says that the look of others, again, that chapter 3, the look of others condemns the elderly. It judges them as creatures without potential. This is what he says. He says, no one asks the aged any longer, what do you want to do? All declare dispassionately and unflinchingly that you've already done. End quote. Society thus moves to protect and confine the vulnerable, robbing them of agency and targeting them for certain death, at least on Amory's view. Now, in June of this year, the coronavirus had more or less departed New York City. We were particularly badly hit in late March and early April, so by June, things felt calmer, and the virus had departed for new epicenters in the United States. And I spoke with a friend about this very point that Amory is making here, that is, how we come to see the elderly as creatures without potential. And my friend told me this. She said her grandmother is 95 and cognitively sharp. She's doing fantastic from a cognitive perspective, but she's no longer able to walk, and therefore she is dependent for most of her daily activities. And because, in the United States as elsewhere, because COVID has ravaged nursing homes, her facility has kept out visitors and dispensed with social gatherings, as so many have, and really confined Granny to her room. She's not allowed to go out. For months, my friend's grandmother has been quarantined, her only contacts electronic, apart from the aides who bathe her and help to dress her. Now, Granny, she's not held back by this. She speaks with family members daily to thwart the depressive effects of isolation. But she's all too aware that for many in her facility, this prolonged lockdown imposes a fate worse than death. Now, had Amory still been living, COVID-19 would have reified his most dystopic fears. Not only does aging rob the aged of agency, it targets them for certain death. Or does it? In what follows, I'd like to suggest that my second point here, aging makes it possible to reimagine one's agency. So to consider the possibility that aging does make this possible, to reimagine one's agency, we must be clear on Amory's meaning of the word quarantine. So recall that there are these two definitions. The first, this definition of the decade of the 40s, nestled between the natural rise and fall of life. And second, the social isolation imposed on the old by society. And it's the second version of quarantine, the second definition of quarantine that we're going to focus on now. To be clear, Amory fears the look of others that judges the old as creatures without potential, that considers them finished with nothing left to contribute. This is Amory's concern. I see at least three problems, if not more, with Amory's assessment of the damning look of others. He seems to imply that because some in society consider the elderly unproductive and dependent, they are thus forced somehow to appropriate that view. This is simply not the case. The aging retain a certain degree of self-direction, even as some faculties wane. So here's what I mean, okay? Think of it this way. If I were to say to you that I believe my children need my constant attention in order to succeed in life, which, by the way, I do not believe that, but let's just go with it for the sake of argument. I believe my children need my constant attention, and I were thus to helicopter parent my children, to sort of hover all the time. That doesn't mean that the only choice my children have is to be smothered by my attention. It is reasonable that they would be prone, sure, to a life of dependence on their mother, if that's the way I had raised them. But it doesn't mean that it's a foregone conclusion, and life is full of examples to the contrary. My children retain a certain amount of autonomy over their own lives, regardless of how I choose to parent. And with regard to Amory, then, the elderly are not required to become unproductive and dependent just because people may view them that way. We're not obliged to transform into someone else's idea of who we should be. So that's my first sort of problem with Amory. The next problem is that his argument that the look of others sidelines the elderly fails to acknowledge that change causes innovation. All of us are aging, right? And as a result, all of us are forced to reconsider how we do things. If, for example, you can't see, you buy glasses. If your knees or your hips deteriorate, you might consider joint replacements. Perhaps very unpleasantly, if you leak urine, you wear a pad, and so forth. We might not want to dwell on these unpleasant aspects of human aging, but people adapt to the deterioration of their bodies. And we adapt in other ways as well. So in the case of my friend's granny, who was quarantined in her nursing home bedroom for months because of the virus, she became very adept at telephone calls, at various modes of technology to communicate. And she actually sorted through a bunch of options that even included leaving the nursing home and sort of working things out to live with family. She determined how she could best flourish despite the limitations that she had. More broadly speaking, we retire from careers in order to pursue other goals. We downsize and live differently. We spend more time in different social settings, perhaps closer to family or in a retirement community. All of these changes require adaptation, innovation, a different sort of socializing. And there are other changes as well. But the point is that change causes us to adapt, to think outside of the box, to get creative. And the change associated with aging does not necessarily confine us, quarantine us, or box us in, but rather it can spur creativity. The third problem with Amory's concern about how the young perceive the old is that it ignores the fact that those who are now elderly may have spent their entire lives preparing themselves and those around them for their participation in this very season of life. So what do I mean? My grandfather, now I'm going to talk about my grandfather. He died at the age of 95. And when he died, we knew exactly how he wished for his funeral arrangements, the service, the burial, what songs would be sung, what scripture would be read. But even before this, even before he died, in the 2 decades earlier, I kid you not, when his strength and vitality were waning, he was very clear with us. He was very clear with us not only about those sort of end goal wishes, but he was clear with us about the process of his declining. And so what do I mean by that? Well, my grandfather, declined within the context of community, his wife, my grandmother, family, church. And as a former bomber pilot in World War II and a former prisoner of war, death was always on his mind. And he wasn't morbid. This was not, morbid. He was pragmatic. He knew he'd seen so many people die. He knew that at any point it could be his turn. And so as a result, he lived with that end view. And his last couple of decades in particular, he talked about his finitude all the time. And he invited us, his family, into his weakening state. He invited us into his aging. And he clarified the struggles with us. I knew very well what was difficult for him, but he also magnified the joys. And I would submit to you that my grandfather's aging was not some self-serving exercise in autonomy. That's not what I'm getting at here. It wasn't just about ensuring that he would get what he wanted when he lost his strength, but rather it was an invitation to think through his aging with him, to walk together, to shoulder the burdens and partake in the delights. So in contrast to Amory's preoccupation that the young have sentenced the elderly to a metaphorical, if not a physical death, I've just argued that actually older members of society retain a degree of self-direction, that change causes innovation and creativity, and that a lifetime of preparation for old age can actually maximize the elderly's exercise of agency. And so next, I'd like to explore a particular tool that does this, and that did this for half a millennium. This was a handbook on the preparation for death, known as the Ars Moriendi, or Art of Dying. And these handbooks really exemplified how a lifetime of preparation for aging and death can maximize one's agency. So that's what we're going to turn to in this last part of the talk. So the Ars Moriendi, Latin for Art of Dying. This was a body of literature wildly popular in the West for more than 500 years. It developed, not in response to the novel coronavirus, but in response to a different epidemic, a particularly devastating outbreak of the bubonic plague that struck Western Europe in the late 1340s, early 1350s. Historians estimate that this particular epidemic took the lives of 1/3, maybe up to 2/3 of Western Europeans. Society was just devastated. And really, there was about 7 to 10 days that separated the first signs of illness from the grave. So people died quickly and without warning, and those who survived feared for the souls of the dead, many of whom had been buried improperly, without appropriate ritual. And people wanted to be able to prepare themselves. They didn't actually want to have to depend on priests, who also, some of whom succumbed to the plague or left town. They wanted to be able to prepare themselves should death swiftly return. Now, no one knows who wrote the first version of the Ars Moriendi, but by 1415, it began to circulate, this first handbook on the art of dying. Immediately, it gained traction, and part of the reason was it was disseminated as members of the Council of Constance that had met before went back. The council had met for 4 years, and as the members went forth back to their home countries, this book had been had come into being, and the printing press wasn't quite up and running yet, but it had come into being, and copies of it were distributed around Europe. And it was translated into multiple languages. And of course, then we have the printing press, and it went everywhere. It was translated into multiple languages. It was modified for other religious and even non-religious communities. So after the Protestant Reformation, there were various Protestant versions, Jewish versions. And by the 1800s, by the time of the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s, if you were brought up well in the U.S., part of being brought up well meant anticipating and preparing for death. This was part of the deal. Now we might have estate planning. Back then, you anticipated your death and you prepared for it. These Ars Moriendi did a couple of things. They gave community members advice and sort of protocols and prayers that they could practice on behalf of the one who was dying. But they also actively advised the dying on how to prepare themselves in these very last stages. These were empowering texts for the young as well as the old. But what do I mean by empowering? Now, one way, so think of this. One way this art of dying, this Ars Moriendi, was described was as a great drama in which the dying person plays the central actor. Okay, so you have a cast, and the lead role is played by the dying person, but all of the surrounding community members had roles to play in this drama. Everyone, as they rehearsed, everyone was mindful that at some point they would get to play the lead, right? So in practice, this meant that over a lifetime, there would be a lot of corporate rehearsing for death. Communities became well aware of how particular members participated or didn't, who knew their lines, who didn't, who showed up for rehearsal, metaphorically speaking, who didn't. Community members were well aware of who was flourishing, who was living a life of virtue, and who wasn't. But there was a sense that the process of living well and dying well was carried out in community. And that's where the elders were. The elders were in community. They weren't sidelined. For the half millennium or so that the Ars Moriendi dominated Western culture, people understood that dying well required living well. And living well meant many things, but perhaps most popularly, it was this idea of growing in the virtues. So cultivating excellences in life, or cultivating the virtues, was central to living well in community. Now, most versions of the Ars Moriendi give, especially the early Ars Moriendi iterations, give special attention to what they called the 5 temptations. You might call these the 5 vices. Temptations to impatience, doubt, greed, despair, and pride. So if these were the things that really threatened dying well, then what people needed to cultivate over a lifetime were the virtues that counteracted them. So cultivating patience instead of impatience, or faith instead of doubt, generosity, not greed, hope, not despair, and humility, not pride. So these virtues provided a shared moral framework in which community members could be nurtured and could grow. And this was a part of rehearsing for one's part in the great drama. But it just wasn't these kind of, maybe esoteric or squishy things like growing in virtue. There were also specific lines to rehearse. So the Ars Moriendi handbooks themselves outlined prayers and practices in which community members, young and old, even children, had a role to play, in which they could participate. So you had to learn the prayers. They sometimes actually took the form of a catechism, sort of a question and answer, Christian, what do you believe, sort of thing. And then the dying person would have to give his answer. But regardless of the form, whether it was a catechism or a prayer or a reading or, a scripture, regardless of the form, these practices were rehearsed in states of sickness and in states of health. Okay, so they were meant to reinforce corporate beliefs about the meaning of life and death. With the dying elder as central actor in the great drama of life, for which she had been rehearsing her whole life, her agency was thus on display, right? She's the central actor. She's acting. She is acting. She's displaying her agency. She demonstrated repeatedly her core values. She had rehearsed her beliefs. And when her faculty started to wane, she was supported by her community who knew well her practices and could exercise them on her behalf. By placing older folks within communities and not peripheral to them, the Ars Moriendi made it possible for community members to exercise the agency of the elderly on their behalf. This was a sort of agency by association. A lifetime of preparation for old age through the practices of the Ars Moriendi did indeed maximize the elders' exercise of agency. There was no quarantine about it. Now, Jean-Améry feared growing old precisely because he conceived of aging as quarantine, a sort of quarantine that society imposed on the aged. But as discussed earlier, just because some impose hygienic isolation on the elderly does not mean older folks are required to accept a posture of passivity. Aging not only opens up opportunity for innovation, it can represent a sort of climax of life. I have a friend named Louis, and my friend Louis Kim calls this the dénouement, which one dictionary defines as the final part of a play, movie, or narrative in which the strands of the plot are drawn together and the matters are explained or resolved. So this kind of life climax is the dénouement of life. And Louis was telling me that he recalled watching the SpaceX doc earlier this summer. He told me he noted that all the years and dollars spent of planning and engineering had culminated in a slow, smooth docking procedure, and that the preparation for the docking itself began quite some distance away from the station. Took a while. It's the same with boats, he told me. Long before the boat sidles up to the dock, its speed is gradually slowed. And then Louis said this. He said, I guess this all could be seen as a larger model for life. Old age is not just a surrender or interruption of youthful activities, he said, but a conscious, deliberate dénouement. Now, I asked Louis if I could quote him, and he told me I could. So there you have it. But this idea that you sort of, it's not like nothing happens in old age. It's not like you're shut away, quarantined. It's actually the climax. And it's something that you slowly and carefully and thoughtfully and deliberately build up to. I love this imagery. Aging with direction, planning, wisdom, and a deliberate, premeditated slowing. This is an aging which keeps the elderly in the pilot's seat. The Ars Moriendi offered just this sort of preparation, but contrary to the SpaceX imagery, aging doesn't always go as planned. We don't always, arrive at our deaths gently and easily. But that doesn't mean that decades of preparation have been a waste, either for ourselves or for the sake of our communities. In fact, the process of preparing for death can be incredibly restorative, generative. As the Apostle Paul puts it, we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. To put it differently, although we are physically dying, all of us, right? Mortality is still 100%. We're all dying, yet we are inwardly and paradoxically being renewed. And this gives us hope. Now, how, you might ask? Well, since this is a conference that is meant to engage a bit of theology, I would be remiss for failing to scratch that surface, despite my not being a theologian professionally. So specifically, we should think briefly about what death means within the context of Christian theology. In Christianity, death exists as a paradox. It is both the final enemy to be destroyed, and it is already abolished by Christ's resurrection, right? Makes no sense. How can it be the final thing to be destroyed, the final enemy to be overcome, and yet already abolished? This is the paradox, okay? The Christian hope in the resurrected Christ is a hope in victory over death, a hope that the faithful will pass from this life over the threshold into true life, uppercase L, and that death thereby loses its sting. Interestingly, the Ars Moriendi completely misses this point. In fact, the late theologian Alan Verhey, in his stunning assessment of the theology of the Ars Moriendi, says this, and I quote, "The basis of Christian hope in God is not just the cross of Christ, but also and especially the resurrection of Christ, in which we may see the power of God to give life to the dust, to make all things new, even us." But Ars Moriendi, he says, is silent about the resurrection. Perhaps that silence is not so curious, but it is a silence that distorts hope. The basis of our hope is not the immortality of the soul, Verhey says. The basis of our hope is the power of God to raise the dead. End quote. For all that the Ars Moriendi offers, through its communal context, its emphasis on virtue cultivation, and the delineation of practices and prayers for the dying and on behalf of the dying, it misses this point on the resurrection. It misses the paradox of Christian death. The Ars Moriendi focuses on death, all right. It focuses on Christ's death as a consolation for the dying, but it overlooks the life-giving hope of the resurrection. Any retrieval of the art of dying tradition must take the risen Christ as its true north. So a retrieval of a resurrection-centric Ars Moriendi could do much. It could do much to bolster the agency of the elderly. But this, of course, leads to another paradox in Christian theology. True agency for the Christian lies in total surrender, not in our best laid plans. Jesus said that those who want to follow him have to be willing to lay down their lives, to take up the cross, to die, and then he will give them true life. And being willing to die in order truly to live requires the resurrection. Thanks so much.